Hello everyone, today we finish our mini-series about the SS. Of course we will talk more about them in individual videos for the various operations that they were involved in and more even just from an ideological point of view, etc. Because as we were saying also last time, there is definitely an immense amount of military history connected with the Waffen-SS, if anything, for what they became. Stopped last time before this happened before Barbarossa. This immense foreign legion consisting of 500,000 volunteers fighting with silver runes on their insignia, primarily against the Soviet Union. This latter aspect is also very important to bear in mind. Today we will also look at the role of the Muslims and the Indians who fought in the SS. Also a bit of a comparison between the Waffen-SS and the Wehrmacht as far as their war crimes were concerned, because even though the SS were definitely more intensive in that, there is a narrative that, if anything, is probably one of the single easiest highlighters of how much a person does not know literally anything about World War II, which also derives from the Allies' necessity after World War II to restore the Germans this lost honor during the war of essentially making the Wehrmacht like the good, epical part of the German armed forces and blaming it all on the SS. That's actually not what really happened. In any case, let's go by degrees. First of all, the concept of the war on Bolshevism. This was an immense motivation for most SS, some of which enlisted, requiring to exclusively fight against the Soviets, not on the Western Front. The other element was, of course, anti-Judaism, that we saw in the other video as well, and that was really generalized homogeneously, by the way, all over the German armed forces. Also in here it's a myth that there was someone who but there were also the people, like say if you were in arms during World War II from the German side, you were mostly doing it for the ultimate purpose of exterminating the Jewry, regardless of what you specifically knew about what was happening, concentration camps, etc. This is very well studied, very well documented, and there are lots of very interesting studies that we can look even at some time. So this was an incredibly powerful cocktail. It served as a convergence point for Hitler's ideology and the followers of various European fascist-inspired groups. Another very important chapter we'll have to deal with on Schwerpunkt is how it's the history of fascism properly meant and how it spread in Europe and why. Right? But what is that, especially regarding the war on Bolshevism, that was surely associated, as you know, and especially in the nationalist socialist ideology, to the idea of Bolshevism equating to the Jewry, because of large amounts of Jews that in Central Eastern Europe had sided with socialism in general historically, even though many actually were against that. And so the idea of the backstabbing is also something we have seen in the video about the Freikorps that were emerging also with this ideology. Since during World War I, the same German High Command had tried to scapegoat the Jews for the failures of the German army, and they had basically to hide the result of the inquiry that they themselves carried out, that instead demonstrated that the Jews were disproportionately fighting in the first line, even more than the rest of essentially ethnic Germans, because many Jews were very, Aryan-looking, telling the truth, especially like they considered their secular history in Germany as almost millenary in a consistent sense by that point. But aside from this, there are all things that we will address, because they're actually much more complicated, of course, than I'm making them, but they also exemplify why eventually such ideology brought defeat in both world wars. I mean, if you are threatened by someone that you feel to be inferior, you should ask yourself whether you're actually the super race that is able to win against. There is no limit in tradition to the extent of victory. It's not that if you're fighting against 1 billion to 1, in theory you can't make. There is definitely a fault within yourself if you accept that at least this is the order of things. Nevertheless, the point I was making was mostly referred to, again, the role of communism. We made multiple videos, one on properly the Soviet abomination of mankind, specifically referring, it's an analysis on Bolshevik ideology, and of course, like the most filthiestly putrescent chapter in the history of mankind, just after communist China. The Soviet Union is one of those things for which every human being, also that had nothing to do with that, should wake up in the morning and feel disgusted by existing. And we're talking about pretty much the same levels involved in other totalitarian ideologies, except with an incredibly much more subhumanizing, scientific, let's say, positively wanted ideology. The sense of what, of course, could happen to Europe, we've seen it from a more military point of view in the video about the Polish Bolshevik War. At the end of World War I, essentially the let's call them Western allies were exhausted by the effort, and essentially Poland was left almost alone dealing with the they first invaded they invaded what would have become at least the Soviet Union completely, and they also woke Ukraine up in a military sense. Then they also were obliged to withdraw, and they stopped the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, on the Vistula, one of the single most important battles in the history of mankind for the future of Europe, right? If Poland had collapsed at that point, Germany would have turned into a communist, it would have turned into a Soviet. Simple as that, and we do not know what would have occurred later, even. You can just imagine. And these were real problems. When you study the history of fascism, regardless of the outcome of the events, you can never sever that from the response towards communism. That was actually the main concern, I think, for most people. Aside from, for example, anti-Semitism was not much of a thing in some countries of Western Europe. I mean, Central and Eastern Europe were rampantly anti-Semitic. Even France, in many ways, had historically been. But other countries like the Netherlands or Italy, that even, like in the latter case, even issued the racial laws. And I made a video on Rome of the age of the fascist empire when these things were happening, also with the first alliance with Germany. Really had a completely different development historically. The Jewry was much more integrated. There were also much less. And so it responded to completely different dynamics from Central Eastern Europe, and naturally was also much more backwards in terms, probably, how the societally speaking, these things had developed to begin with. Then, of course, there was some anti-Semitism generalized also in the Anglosphere, etc. It's not something unknown, definitely. There were lots of fascists in Britain, lots of Nazi sympathizers in the United States. This is also completely normal. I mean, just look today how many people sort of self-sabotage, even for causes that will go at the detriment of their life quality and, say, mainstay in the world, etc. These are all things that people tend to look at sort of individually and say, oh, look, but there were people who believe it. Yeah, because if you have never had a comprehensive view of the world, this seems something strange to you. You know what's the etymology of the word stupid? It's stupere, which can be translated as something like, be amazed, like finding out like something that you didn't know. So essentially stupidity comes with ignorance and vice versa, and frankly there is nothing to be surprised of. Just looking at the average level of literacy, that even in the most educated countries in the world, it's objectively embarrassing. The general sense, however, is that it is important to recover, one must understand what actually failed and why, right? And this is not the video actually for doing so, even though we will see the same Waffen-SS downfall, right? But on the other hand, you have to understand why these things happened to begin with, right? And so understanding that even if they weren't the right answer to the problem did exist, and it was actually much more serious. We found out after World War II, actually from within the same, when the Cold War kicked in, and that really threatened to destroy the world, coming pretty close to the very eventuality. Reason for which, as I was saying before, we'll understand it better at the end. The Western Allies after World War II had to cooperatively make the room for a rehabilitation of Germany as a whole, that of course was split in two at the time, and was also the first line in a European war. In general, during the Cold War, we would have been the first to be turned into ashes in case of a nuclear holocaust. The sense is, however, that from this, some very strange theories developed that mostly are conspiratorial in nature, and practically denying all the evidence that the National Socialist regime provided us beautifully. All the documentation that we have regarding the Holocaust is quite bureaucratically and tightly produced by the nationalist socialist state, because they were that relatively efficient to that, and so well organized, at least in the recording of it all, that we didn't even have to search more than much to understand what happened. And this goes in parallel with and this is what shocks me a bit, not the fact that there are people who deny the Holocaust, because you would expect them to always exist, but the fact that not just that they deny the Holocaust, but they focus on that rather than on the actual, not rehabilitatively relevant aspect of the world, but on the actual reasons that stem from the anti-communistic push that most of fascism and Nazism actually occurred as a response to the same. Again, I'm tempted to start making a series on the history of fascism, because that is, I think it is somehow more necessary than we realize. Also on communism, it would be important to actually show what it was, but if you imagine the lamest, level of incapability, of stupidity, of complete waste of human life for winning a war with 20 million dead is not really much winning a war, especially if the Axis countries that you have fought turn to become the richest countries, and especially the longest living countries in the world, and you are still basically a subculturally underdeveloped pool of of the generation for generations and generations to come. You do not come out normal from socialist regimes, right? We know well. Look at the divide that still exists, not just with post-Soviet countries, with post-socialist ones in Europe. It's utterly embarrassing. It's something shocking. Like in the French, the Germans, the Italians have to actively pay post-socialist countries within the European Union with pumping in an enormous amount of money every year in order to fix what happened. And still with the fear that they're not essentially able to think of themselves outside of their paranoid bubble that is a specifically and surgically established product of the socialist regimes. It takes just even a generation under it. You're completely fucked up in the head. And we are trying to fight this still. And I'm shocked also by the fact that many conservatives say, oh, those are kind of more traditional countries. Really? You think that they know what tradition is? Don't confuse being underdeveloped with being traditional. It has nothing to do with that. That's the great illusion that brings people to delude themselves in a sort of feministic fantasy, because it's sensualistically based. It has nothing to do with virility, with authority, with discipline, with order, with the superiority of Western civilization. It's something completely different, right? Lesser people in our world always side with inferior cultures. It's always been like this. The reason is that they want to self-sabotage the system in which they personally screw up and fail, so that they cannot feel threatened by the fact of being lesser people. Right? The world, by the way, going back on at least the aspect of the following of the various European fascist-inspired groups in the world before or during World War II, was teeming with far-right organizations. There was even a Nazi party in the Samoa Islands. In that case, because, as you know, those lands had once colonially belonged to Germany. But the picture was actually much more vast, as we were saying before. Such political movements, though the formally established ones, included a paramilitary element prepared to engage in warfare pretty much everywhere in the world. I mean, that such groups existed to support the Axis. As early as 1938, Himmler had anticipated that non-Germans, however still of Germanic descent, could also enlist in the SS. As we were talking about before in the previous video, at some point the staggering losses, especially on the Eastern Front, brought Germany to start enlisting people that actually had nothing to do with Nordic ancestry, if not very vaguely. The idea was that, and this is really in line with the main racialistic theories of the time, especially in Northern Europe, that, at least in the Germanic world, that tended to essentially still think that the Wehrmacht was Scandinavia. They didn't know of the Kurdanic issue as well. They tended to essentially see themselves as the spring of whiteness in absolute terms. That also was a very German thing because of all the contempt with the Slavs that, at least in some part, were and are pretty fair, as you know. So there would be a lot to say about that. But the sense is that, at least within Western Europe, you could always find some element of Germanic descent that, on the basis of the racialistic standards that the Waffen-SS had, that required to enlist, would allow, in fact, these individuals to join the ranks. Following the occupation of the Nordic countries in the early phase of the war, as you know, candidates from Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands that were all occupied by the Nazis, but there were people that came even from Sweden, as you know. That there was a great sympathy, of course, from the Finnish side for obvious reasons. I made a video about the Soviet-Finnish, the Winter War, so-called Winter War, and so there was enough manpower at this point to form two regiments of the Waffen-SS that were the Nordland, consisting of Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, and Finns, and the Westland, comprising Dutch and Flemish soldiers. When combined with the Germania regiment, which was primarily made up of ethnic Germans, namely Austrians and individuals from the Sudetenland, they established the SS Division Viking. In January 1941, initiating rigorous training in preparation for Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Equipped with an armored component superior to that of a Wehrmacht Panzer Division, it was initially classified as a motorized division, showcasing a combat readiness that was on par with the original divisions of the Waffen-SS. The success of Viking led to the formation of additional foreign units which expanded the German troop structure and compensated for the losses incurred, essentially getting, of course, soldiers from other countries that were not essentially represented, at least would not provide that further amount of troops. As you know, in the East there were, the Romanians, the Hungarians, plus of course within the Axis the Italians, etc. These would all provide with their own SS elements, but these these volunteers swelled the ranks for all the reasons that we were also ideologically talking about before and in the previous video. Now, some of these elements enlisted due to their anti-communist sentiments, as we were saying before, specifically willing to serve only on the Eastern Front. They were truly concerned about that and the expansion of the Soviet Union. In total, approximately 500,000 non-Germans joined the Waffen-SS, making up about half of the overall force. These were racially selected. The largest contingent was Latvian, with around 80,000 men. What is interesting about this is, of course, the fact that there was an incredibly anti-Soviet hatred, in particular among these peoples in the Baltic, but also within the same Soviet Union. I talked about Ukraine extensively. If you go in my newly created 20th century history content, that is still relatively contained, you will find that, or also there is the Ukrainian history playlist for that matter. Many people in the Soviet Union were, of course, greeting the Axis as liberators, and quite wholeheartedly. Right, and a major flaw, of course, in nationalist socialist policy and strategy was to essentially, yes, accept that support, but making these people understand that they were still an inferior race and that they would have had to make room with their eventual killing to the German Lebensraum. And that was incredibly dumb to begin with, because the Soviet Union was a disgusting pool of hysterical paranoia, terror, incompetence, complete disorder, and the only reason it sort of kept together was the fear of being exterminated. Like if the Nazis hadn't pushed for that, they would have likely won the war in a broader sense. Right, Stalin got drunk immediately as Barbarossa began because he feared that absolutely, like a revolution. This is very well documented. Because nobody trusted anyone, right? In fact, of course, the Latvians do not have a great opinion of the Russians in general, but of course there were 60,000 Russians, for example, joining the SS. Then we have 50,000 Dutch and Romanians. Remember, the Romanians were there with their army proper in the Eastern Front, in the south sector that also was quite important, Crimea and so on. You have then between 15,000 and 20,000 Italians enlisted starting from late 1943 in the Erste Sturmbrigade Italienische Freiwilligen-Legion, which was destined to become the Italienische Nummer 1 in 1944, after demonstrating its combat effectiveness during the Allied landing at Anzio. This was very important because during this time, 1944, the Italian SS earned the right to display the distinctive black insignia. Prior to that, Himmler had penalized the dishonor of the armistice with the Allies in 1943 by assigning them a red insignia instead. So at this point it was also the Social Republic in northern Italy. Mussolini had already been extracted by the Germans and used at that point as a verbal puppet to gather this Italian fascist resistance against the Allies. Other Italians served in the Karstjäger Division, originally composed of Tyroleans that were also in great numbers of German descent themselves and primarily engaged in suppressing the Yugoslav partisans, which the Italians had been somehow darkly efficient at doing. Remember, always the concentration camps were initiated in a truly, orderly sense by the Italians in Libya, then also in Yugoslavia. But this aspect is interesting because, of course, Italy was the second most important partner of Germany in the Axis, and the role of this power, the sort of all the dichotomies. We will talk about this in the video, in fact, about the fascist empire, Hitler's visit to Rome, etc. This idea of Germanicity and Romanity in the face of, at that point, like, this is well after Stalingrad, this is about, in fact, after the Allied landings in Italy, and so it's a very down spiraling situation, which, however, as we will see now, the Götterdämmerung sort of vibe starts emerging. So there is this chance of rhetoric of utmost resistance to the death, because that's how, essentially, if you have to go, you have to go. That is still resonating very much in neo-Nazi, neo-fascist groups, at least in the broader rhetoric of the Second World War. Then, of course, these people, as I always say, fascists and communists back in the day did actually get themselves killed for a cause. Today, this is just chit-chat. Now, this is the point, how also the SS performed towards the catastrophe. Because in the final months of the war, the SS found themselves ensnared in desperate battles, culminating in the extreme defense of the Berlin bunker. In the anticipation of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia set to commence on June the 22nd, 1941, the SS, the Waffen-SS units Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf were elevated to the status of elite armored divisions, while the Polizei remained designated as a second-line unit. To these units was added a 5th division, the Viking, composed primarily, as we've seen, of volunteers of Nordic origin, including Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, Finns, Estonians, Dutch, and Flemish. This marked the beginning of a radical transformation in the nature of the Waffen-SS. We pointed out how they had been born a bit, idealistically. The Wehrmacht did not think much of them. Some units sort of so underperformed, they were disbanded after the invasion of Poland. Rommel did not want them in Africa. There is a shift that occurs, especially with Barbarossa, and accelerates with increasing intensity starting in 1942, which is, however, the moment in which things start, they peak, right, but eventually start going down. As the heavy losses suffered by the units in the preceding months became unmanageable under the original selective criteria of racial purity. There would have been too few soldiers to enlist. Men of various nationalities began to flow into the ranks of the SS, whose combat performance varied significantly. They primarily operated in the rear, to counter partisan activities rather than on the front lines under the command of mostly German officers, and many of these men perceived the new assignment as a demotion, leading to a detrimental decline in the efficiency and discipline of the units, which subsequently saw an increase in looting, theft, and massacres. This is important because some units became elite on the Eastern Front, but as we were saying before, like this entire sense of you have been so much indoctrinated to think that you're basically the master race and that you don't need other soldiers to fight for you, especially if they are actually non-European ancestry, etc., that you start thinking that this is going towards at least a direction that does not motivate you anymore. And given the course of the war from this point onwards, things are really becoming more desperate, right? People say the entire war effort basically needs anybody to be thrown into the meat grinder, and much of the losses probably cannot be compensated at a point even to create organically sound and military performing units, right? So you have the veterans of the Eastern Front, and naturally are top notch in many ways, but they are also exhausting themselves, also numerically. And then you have the new recruits that are something else. Naturally, there is a balance that, as you know, holds until the end of the war for at least some of these very units, while things around are sort of declining. We talked about Waffen-SS, for example, in the Battle of Normandy, made a mini-series in June dedicated to that. And so, of the approximately 40 large units that claim the title of SS, perhaps only a dozen could be truly classified as elite troops. In the Soviet Union, the Waffen-SS played a crucial role in the ethnic cleansing war, the Vernichtungskrieg, not only as frontline units but also as rear-line security formations. Notably, a third of the members of the Einsatzgruppen, that is, the mobile extermination squads responsible for the mass murder of the Jews, as well as Soviet civilians and partisans, were recruited from within the ranks of the Waffen-SS in anticipation of the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Red Army and Soviet partisans exhibited equal brutality in seeking revenge, which only intensified the actions of the Waffen-SS and actually improved their performance in the field. The SS were employed to mitigate every crisis situation, aware that surrender would likely result in execution. So they had essentially no other chance but to win or die. This reality persisted until the final horrific days of the defense of Berlin, which Hitler himself envisioned, as we're pointing out before us, as the most epic and dramatic fall of the gods in the history. Given the notoriety they earned on the Eastern Front, it's not surprising that the Allies approached the Waffen-SS with a sense of dread on the Western Front. Right? In total, again, also the troops in France, as you know, had just spent vacations there during World War II. But at some point, they were reinforced by veritable veteran units, part of which had already been there and fought since Normandy, as we were pointing out before. And so there was a general fame and reputation for, in fact, for lack of mercy, of this radical violence and fierce indoctrination that the SS had, positively obtained. Even in their last battles, we've seen it in the video about the Battle of the Ardennes, the Malmedy massacre, for example, these German troops did not refrain from committing massacres of prisoners and civilians. It is honestly important to notice that the Allies were equally guilty as far as the prisoners were concerned, perpetrating abuses and killings of comparable magnitude. And it depends also which Allies we're talking about. But so I'm here we're talking about the West, where some colonial troops were pretty despicable. As you know, the Soviets in general, we're not talking about the latter, for example, because they could be that animal-like without any doubt. However, indeed, there was a difference. Like the Waffen-SS were sort of carrying this out largely because they had been sort of designed to reason in those terms. In the West, as we will see, it's true also for the Wehrmacht, to an extent, there is less collective responsibility. As a matter of fact, it's more of a sort of ad personam issue. Not only, however. So they're not comparable. This is not to say, Schwerpunkt said that, so, the SS, the Allies were as bad as the SS. That's not what I said. If you do not understand the difference between absolute and relative, you may want to successfully complete first world primary schooling. Nonetheless, the SS ranks were dwindling, right? Their vehicles were running low on fuel, and the impending defeat was becoming increasingly palpable. The Allied troops had to gain, however, still considerable combat experience before overcoming their inferiority complex concerning the combat-hardened units of the Waffen-SS. And experience there is everything, right? It's not just about the Eastern Front is a hell of a school, but the general just aptitude to combat, to knowing how to be on a campaign and fighting consistently, having seen that, having done that, the Americans, the British began to inject like lots of forces that did not have that, and so just by default, there were something different. And compared to the SS that had, at least to the most effective units that had become elite, but were at this point elite, also in a numerical sense within the same Waffen-SS. Plus, consider, of course, battle exhaustion, right? There were veterans that were not sort of capable anymore. This is also what was discovered for the first time historically, at least in a greater sense, given the intensity of World War II. Not only that, even very good veteran units at some point were overspent. Like today, basically no operator in a normal context stays in more than 40 days of combat. After that, he will become an instructor. Then, of course, wars, as we know, are fought in much worse conditions, and this was one of the cases, but we're much more aware today of what it means to calibrate such factors adequately. Each victory secured against the Waffen-SS was perceived as more significant than those achieved over any other adversary, contributing to the myth of the super warriors adorned with silver runes, a myth that endures to this day. Indeed, there is that sort of overestimation. We have seen what the Waffen-SS were conceived for and how their quality floated depending on who they were, depending on which moments of the war. And of course, every time you make a video about the Waffen-SS, there is the mentally deficient idiot that comes up with, but the SS were elite, they were all cool, they were all good. Yeah, if you are at that level, I'm not sure that Schwerpunkt is, the most suitable content for you. It's better that I don't say which one it is, because I would be banned from YouTube. But just know that being military historically literate is a hallmark of lack of virility to begin with. Now let's talk about these other aspects of Waffen-SS. The Muslims and the Indians who died for the Reich, which is yet another very interesting topic, not much because of the participation of these individuals, but because of how rather the Nazis saw the entire issue. As you know, the anti-Jewish hatred had brought to some extent, not inexplicably, because as we've seen, the Germans needed supporters all over the world, so that would have happened anyway. But still, to the point that, I don't know, even racial standards do not actually matter anymore. As we were saying before, some European Jews were peculiarly white and Nordic looking. You hire, I don't know, a guy from India, on average, in spite of the Vedic, Indo-European injection, it's not exactly, a hallmark of hyper whiteness. The same goes actually for other, think about other Semites. That's the other thing that always puzzles me, in the way ridiculously the term anti-Semite is used without remembering it. In fact, there are actual people who actually are called anti-Semitic because they hate the Jews and that actually support, I don't know, Palestinian terrorists that make themselves explode to kill them, as if those were, anything. Admittedly, in tradition, in fact, there is a spiritual dimension that can transcend the same bodily one, except most of these people do not even know what that means, nor they seem to be eager to make an exemption for the Jews, because they have been raised with the idea that the only thing that matters in the world is hating the Jews. This is heavily disturbing and betraying that sense of tradition, as a matter of fact. So there is, however, this other aspect too, that in part is the search for that Indo-European ancestry of spirit among these other peoples, the Indians, for example. We'll see now also what kind of names they were attributed in this symbolical way. All these SS units had all their national badges. They aspired to traditional symbolism. This was particularly evident, I don't know, you have St. George, you have the Fasces, you have, plenty of those ethnic, historic, also medieval ones, right? I don't know, the Ukrainian SS had the Galician lion badge. I made a video about Galicia, Volhynia, the Middle Ages. Are particularly interesting. There is, of course, the other aspect, that is the anti-Allied sentiment existing in colonized peoples, such as the Indians, of course, against the British, or the Arabs, in fact, in general, against the other. Well, the French had now mostly been under, as you know, but there was also during the 1944, 1945, the sense of, things were collapsing pretty much everywhere there, but there were mixed feelings, of course, locally, especially against the British, given the siding against the Axis. Things began to fall apart, but this is also, in fact, mirrored by the elimination of those racial standards for the necessity to compensate for the significant number of casualties during the war, leading Hitler and Himmler to open enlistment to volunteers from this broader Eastern world. Himmler was captivated by the Islamic religion. That's something we have to talk about, because this still exists in that, as I was saying before, anti-Jewish sense. Today, the sense that the Muslims were sort of recording some sort of primal sense of the Indo-European struggle through the Sasanian Persian religion. In part it is true. The problem mostly there stands with some specific doctrinal issues that do not make actually Islam particularly beyond that Semitic dimension that the Nazis were so obsessed for, also regarding the Jewish law and everything. But we will have to talk more about this aspect, so you understand how everything was sort of subjectivized to an extent. Even the same hatred towards Christianity that we were pointing out before, it was hypocritical. Not just because, again, Europeans were Christians overwhelmingly, as the Germans, within them leading such struggle, but because, as we just said before, there was also a Christian symbolism. It referred to Christian figures. Think about Charlemagne. Think about this sense of ambiguity always to untangle in a strictly historical, religious, and traditional sense regarding the symbol, the myths, the degree by which the regime led by people at least who hated Christianity and or at least loathed it as some sort of Jewish byproduct, erroneously, especially considering Western Catholicism in the wake of tradition, the Latin Germanic accomplishment in that regard, are part of the broader incoherence and the failure of the nationalist socialist regime. But Himmler, again, because of this, the Nazis, were very orientalistically obsessed for these specific reasons. There was some sort of colonialistic thing, like the Germans had been big in this also research in the East, as you know, in the previous generations, etc. Himmler promotes the establishment of the 13th Waffengebirgsdivision, die 13. Waffengebirgsdivision der SS, Kroatische 1, in 1943, which consisted, in this sense, not of Croatians, but of Bosnian Muslims. This division was named Handschar after an oriental scimitar that, this is yet one of those symbolisms that we were talking about before, that appeared prominently in its coat of arms and was used locally in anti-partisan operations, literally cutting people to pieces with that. Consider that in all of this there is already, for example, what would become a Yugoslavian resistance that was naturally in contact with the communists. That's how eventually, of course, it was the communist takeover in Yugoslavia, but it remained sort of separated from at least the strict, or any, telling the truth, Kremlin's directive. Like Khrushchev was notoriously intimidated by Tito at some point. It was a bit like Sweden for the Western Bloc in a way, of course differently, but still so. Yugoslavia resistance was pretty nasty, to say the least. In any case, in 1944, Hitler met with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Think about the current times and that paradox I was talking about before. al-Husseini, who had managed to escape from Persia. Remember that Persia had been taken over by the Brits to open to control better the Caspian corridor that arrived up to Volgograd. The Stalingrad at the mouth of the Volga, which was crucial for the land lease. It's not just the Arctic route, but it was from India what the British could put up to the Soviet Union through Iran. And that's why also he was there in part, and because the Allies knew that the Arabs were against them in general. Not only, of course, but in this sympathy of anti-Jewish mentality that Hitler proposed. So that when he met with the Grand Mufti, that again had escaped from Iran with the assistance of the Italian military intelligence service, the meeting resulted in a mutual understanding between Hitler and the Arab world against the Jews. Very simple, like that. Great Britain, communism were also the other enemy that, of course, like the Islamic integralists would agree on. Surely communism is much less traditional than Islam, so that there is no doubt. But we also have to see in the degree of application who's doing what, right? Because the Soviet Union is not the Arab world, definitely, and power was displayed evidently, in spite of all the mess. So civilizationally, you must always think how the imperium manifests. With al-Husseini's collaboration, the Osttürkische Waffenverband, the SS, was formed, which was later transformed into the Erste Ostmuslimanisches SS Regiment, comprising Muslim individuals from various Asian ethnic groups. of course, there was some level of racial selection. This was important because the Nazis were still searching also among these ethnicities, not just anybody, but still people who were sort of wider and could be connected with sort of the broader Aryan migrations that maybe also the Turks were blended with from the migration era. We talked about this in many other instances. And so they were fabricating this. If you think about the idea of the Philistines being Indo-European groups, indeed so, but like this doesn't mean that 20th century Arabs living in Palestine were next to the Jews, by the way, that came from the same exact places after millennia of those people's times, were actually anything separated from them. So it's actually very weird and paradox, also because many Arabs in the regions are actually of Jewish descent themselves historically, and they were just brought down by the Arabs. I mean, what you see, that's the point. They're actually broadly Semitic in the area, but we're talking the early Islamic invasions. I have a video on Heraclius, by the way, coming at some point up. And ironically, being just the descents of Jewish converts, forced converts at a point to Islam. Now, this Erste Ostmuslimanisches SS Regiment was actively involved in the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising. So, like, they acted, as we'll see now, importantly in Europe. We have also to talk about the Warsaw Uprising. If any of you visits Warsaw, I really advise to visit the Uprising Museum. Among the others, there's the military historical one, there is also one of the probably of the Holocaust. But it's something, when I visited it the first time, I don't know if it's still organized in the same way, but it does give you an idea of how, you know, they impress you psychologically to understand what it felt like. It's sort of almost claustrophobic. It almost feels to be under a bombardment with all the various effects, etc. It's beautiful. Aside from the city that bears that scar, like more than a scar, right? It's a completely rebuilt city, as you know, as Berlin. In any case, but I'll see that in a slightly different way. This Asians, this Muslim Asians, conducted operations behind enemy lines. Furthermore, there is the notable case of the Indian nationalist Subhas Chandra Bose, who was opposed to British rule, and so a great candidate for the Nazis at that point. He successfully united a force called the Legion Freies Indien Tiger, which included 1,500 Indian prisoners of war. So these were soldiers that had served the British Empire and had ended up being captured by the Germans, their allies, and they were offered this chance to enlist in this SS Indian force. For example, one of these companies even fought on the Italian soil against the Allies, rising up the peninsula. The Wehrmacht's responsibilities, that's yet another important topic that I was highlighting before, and we have to be totally honest about this because it's not like you can simply ignore it. As you know, in Schwerpunkt we make traditional content. I'm definitely a right-wing individual, without any doubt, but this doesn't automatically make anyone like someone who condones specific actions, and not because they've been told or because they've been trained to think so. As a matter of fact, one day I will be sort of even more open about these topics, especially the more we talk about, especially the 20th century, because you have the strange things. When I make these videos, and I say something like this that basically criticizes, to say the least, what National Socialism did, I say, but are you a Jew by chance? Like, there's this strange, comments coming up that are actually quite amusing by them, the way they manifest regarding the fact that you talk about the war in Poland in 1939. It says obvious things such as the fact that the Poles could win that war and they screwed up and badly even. But of course, together with the French, we needed to heroicize them a little bit, right? Also, especially the resistance. So, chapeau to them in many ways, but also downplaying other resistances. For example, the biggest and most organized and actually sort of militarily accomplishing in the war was the Italian one. But nobody talks about that too much because the Italians are instead vilified for other reasons, or at least they're not taken seriously in this broader effort, which is actually a severe issue there. And you say, but are you a Pole by chance? Like, how is this? If you criticize National Socialism for whichever, depending on the topic, you do so, but are you this? Are you that? That's the kind, and these are mostly profiles, sort of fake profiles with freicards, pictures with something referring to National Socialism in a more or less veiled way, because they're never open. They never say, I'm a Nazi, and so you can identify. No, that's also weird about this. As I was saying before, the Nazis had the balls of getting themselves killed, just like the communists, the fascists at the time. Today, people do not even have the balls of saying what they think. Freaking fake profile. And that's, I think, just the measure of the moral degeneration of the world in whichever direction you take. But the history of the Wehrmacht, first of all, I would like to point out this, and at some point I will say the story. I owe my existence to Wehrmacht soldiers. No, I'm not talking about rape, if some of you thought about that kind of way, but my paternal grandfather was actually almost getting killed in some of these processes, but I owe his life to properly German soldiers to an extent that I don't know what I'd give to know these people. I don't know even if they survived the war, honestly. I would probably never know, and likely is that, if you were a young adult male during World War II in Germany, that, your chances of survival are not terrifically high, especially if you're already where this thing happened. But they make you think. Maybe these people were absolutely, they were absolutely Nazi, they were absolutely hating the Jews, but they displayed a sense of humanity in that case that, of course, cannot make me personally be clear-cutting, but for this reason also subjective. You have to be objective at these things coexisting. And so one day we'll talk about this. Now, according to the most updated studies that are openly accessible, the regular army, the Wehrmacht, was also guilty of horrific crimes. This is something that I personally didn't even need to go to school to know. It's common knowledge. Then when I got on the internet, when I got on YouTube, I discovered that there is a large swath of actually adult people who believe that the Wehrmacht was innocent of any crime, that were good people, that were just fighting for their fatherland, that, I don't know, maybe the evil guys were the SS or other people that are generally sympathizing towards National Socialism, making the point that the entire story of Wehrmacht war crimes is a fabrication, and we all know the story there. Now, it's definitely, speaking popularly, because that's what I discuss on YouTube, it's definitely well known that the Waffen-SS was responsible for war crimes, to say the least. The Wehrmacht, however, is less known to have not been an exception, as recent research, of course, has abundantly demonstrated, and just like everybody knew, right? you can't even distinguish them. I mean, it's not like the Waffen-SS were simply out of control, or we're doing this without the actual control of the German High Command, and the same Wehrmacht units were quite autonomous in many ways. So for a long time, there was this at least common myth, or even prevailing opinion, that the German army had exhibited more honorable behavior, and that one could refer to a healthy Wehrmacht. You see, the point here is that, of course, those war crimes were known, but there was a sort of categorical Manichaean division to say, well, but that maybe was just, I don't know, it was a reprisal or whatever. Aside from the fact that, yes, you can respond to guerrilla resistance, etc., in certain ways, but, say, massacring 10 civilians for, I don't know, a single German guy killed is not really, what is considered conventionally not a war crime, right? Aside from that, innocent civilians, by the way, because you can't have civilians pick up arms, of course, and that's the case, and you can't kill them, of course. That's of course, it should require a particular handling of the matter, not simply killing them at the moment if they are not in the act of, they're not dangerous. However, that is, yes, a thing that does happen and did happen in many circumstances all over, the armies of World War II. But, right, what we're talking here is basically the same level of practice. An organization with a different ethic than that of the Waffen-SS. This was the idea, right? And the Waffen-SS being scapegoated, in contrast, being so indoctrinated that they would violate every principle of humanity. So the Waffen-SS, yes. So that's also the cowardice and the hypocrisy of people who often covert National Socialist sympathizers. Oh yes, the Waffen-SS bad, but the Wehrmacht were kind of fine. We're just fighting against communism, so they didn't make any war crime whatsoever. That's not how it works, right? It's good. I mean, if you could separate the anti-communist aspect from the war crime, that the former would be praisable and the latter still despicable. The point here is that it was being denied as a whole that this war crime still have existed to begin with. And regarding the members of the Wehrmacht, one could at most speak of personal and not collective responsibilities. That much is true. I mean, the idea of, one officer, one soldier, so depending on also the hierarchical role, ordering or taking the initiative, whatever, and killing people, civilians indiscriminately, etc., is very well documented in the Wehrmacht, and to a very large degree of documentation and episodes and general evidence in so many ways. This was objectively less in scale than the SS, but still of the same nature of crimes. So the sense that ideologically, these were different people, this is the myth that has been inculcated. But the Wehrmacht wouldn't kill for the same reasons of fanatic ideologism in which the Waffen-SS were indoctrinated. Remember the first video, that's the main difference in the training of the Waffen-SS from the Wehrmacht, that the former were added an extra degree of a curriculum of proper political indoctrination. I mean, the soldiers of the German army were abundantly indoctrinated by the regime themselves. The Waffen-SS just had the additional thing, but all the reasons for killing, the racial inferiority that is actually like the first thing mixed with anti-bolshevism, with anti-Judaism, it's common, it's homogeneous. We know very well that among the German soldiery, the single most common denominator was anti-Jewish hatred, even more than anti-communistic one, seemingly. Even though, as I just said, it's difficult to districate them in the nationalist socialist view of the story. So why am I talking about this? Specifically to make a point, not just what is obvious to anyone who knows World War II. We already knew, right? Discovering of the Wehrmacht, abundant war crimes, even some of the most ferocious of World War II is discovering cold water. What I'm interested in, rather, is, and there are again many crimes also in other armies among the Allies. There is no doubt about this. However, yes, the Nazis exceeded often, at least if we speak with Western Allies, in comparison. That's a completely different story, right? It's pure moral relativism and ignorance to suggest that there was an equality in that regard. What I'm interested in, rather, is explaining why this opinion came around to begin with. And it's incredibly important because it's the product of many other distortions that in pop culture have taken root about World War II. You think that we're, by 21st century, aware of what World War II was? No. Nobody has ever studied World War II in a thoroughly comprehensive way. It's debatably impossible to do so. But there definitely could have been so much more to be made systemically and with specific moral and scientific criteria that unfortunately our academia hasn't quite met with in general. Now, there was a very specific political problem after the war, and especially at the onset of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. That is to say, we had in the West to, of course, get the Germans from our side at that point. It's difficult even to speak of the retribution that the Germans had, not just the millions of dead, destroyed cities and so on, but the general annihilation of, they were brutally butchered down, as warfare must be done in any case. The other attackers style, mentally underdeveloped, Fort Estater, disorderly, paranoid sense of Churchill was the bad guy, or similar things, is just what lesser people by definition think. And we should recover the sense of the lesser and the greater, right, as a rigid hierarchy of order and purity and virility in our world. If anything, there is a reason why I have the von Clausewitz avatar. Is the moral dimension of a beaten down people, like still in the 50s, the average German thought that Hitler hadn't actually been that kind of a bad guy. And in my opinion, I don't think that anyone, especially in these guys, yes, there was a Nuremberg process trial. There was, for example, the Italians didn't have this. The Japanese did not have this. That's something that really changes a lot. Actually, it's remarkable, especially for all these countries. So West Germany, also the way it managed to reintegrate successfully East Germany, that was, of course, much more of a disaster. But especially Italy and Japan to have developed into, at least Japan, of course, in its own way, in a very cultural different way from the West, especially Italy, considering Southern Europe passed all through fascism after World War II, up to the 70s, etc. Italy was, from, say, the end of the war, unshakingly what we call improperly sort of democratic, say, at least for the meaning of democratic country, that maintain standards that are actually the ones of a full sort of Western country in terms of, pillar of NATO and etc. And that's something that you must appreciate, even, and with all the deficit, definitely Italians paid for in terms of actual, yes, in that sense of democracy in our land. And there were this also in Germany, everywhere, in France, etc. Like red and black terrorism during the 1960s, 1970s, the 80s even. The world has its problems, but these countries were able to step further, right? And in many ways, however, this happened by hiding something about what had occurred, right? And in the German case, it was in part this, that that story of Rommel, the great knight, the story of the Germans who fought for the fatherland were great, honorable people. That's been essentially a Manichaean heresy that has been designed by the Allies after World War II to essentially distract the people from the past and making them focus on the Cold War issue, which was obviously much more pressing at that point, and winning especially Germany as the core of it all. I mean, the Cold War, as a consequence of World War II, had passed through the destruction of Germany. It's not like the Americans thought too much of the Germans. Today, in spite of the many German Americans that I think are the largest group of, at least they were historically among the whites in the U.S., like this great ideation and sort of sense of everybody's obsessed about Nazi uniforms and video games, and those are the cool looking guys that we also somehow should appreciate because they were kind of traditionals like we're in today. This is a sort of culture that was born with the internet 20 years ago. And especially during World War II, there was a ferocious anti-German hatred from a large part of just the Anglosphere in general. This was so also during World War I, this mental disturbance that the Germans would have allegedly been this third millennium civilization already in World War II compared to Britain, that the British should have not even gone at war with because just it would have happened nothing because it wasn't World War II and they weren't like Hitler later. It's all the product of a subnormal anti-traditional degeneration, forgetting what those very powers in both world wars actually believed about the Germans. And it's not even a myth. I mean, the Germans were the first ones who wanted to be called like that. The Kaiser wanted specifically the Germans to be seen by their enemies as the Huns of the situation. That's how the term came around, exactly boasting that ferocity and lack of scruple. Right? You know what happened to Holland. You know what happened to London during World War I, not just during World War II. But these examples of ferocity were completely normal for nations at war, and still are. The BS of the British and the German soldiers that exchange pictures of families, it is of course fourth estater paranoid superstition that thinks that there are the terrible elite that send them to war, as if a country could go at war just because the elite says, and everybody's opposed, but for some reason they go themselves. If anything, that would mean that people are worthless. In part they are, so that's how it partly even does happen, but it's not like they didn't see that Germany was a threat to them just for the reason they would go at war, also because they were hyper-pumped, not just by a distorting propaganda, but by the obvious reason of imperial competition for hegemony in Europe, at least mostly from the German continental side. And the British wanted, as always, since ever in their strategy, keep down everyone who would hegemonize Europe, because otherwise they would find themselves in trouble. I mean, this is against the French since the 17th, even before to a degree, century, what the thing got down to. So the myth that the Germans would have been just, after all, good guys that were just, misled by this crazy Hitler, but after all, of course, was enforced specifically in the Cold War period, as German armed forces were expected to make a significant contribution within the Atlantic Alliance. And it is actually even completely normal. Right? This is not like you use Weber at that point. You need to restore the honor the lost honor of these people because you need to counter communism. Yeah, this happened also with Italian fascism, neo-fascism. The CIA did not want to work with them, but the Italian government explained them that these, in case of Soviet invasion, the Warsaw Pact invasion, would have actually fought alongside the Americans. And so there was a lot of terrorism, there were lots of big communist parties in all these countries. You know what's that terrible, dreaded time was, really. That's also where the subnormal Marxistic ideology entrenched itself into the universities from the same period. So it's really very, very recent and obvious history that everybody should be aware of. Just maybe the again, I don't even know how to qualify the newest generations. I'm starting to wonder whether we can actually even school them anymore. Like, what's the point of it? In practical terms, just like you would like to restore the honor of the Germans during World War II for practical purpose, let's consider not schooling children at this point in history anymore, because what are they able to do when they are older, given the preconditions of the last 20 years or so. Now, what my final point is that a veil of oblivion obscured the experiments, for example, on human beings conducted by the Wehrmacht itself, the brothels filled with sexual slaves, massacres of civilians during reprisals, and many other crimes committed that were entirely analogous to those attributed to the SS. There was nothing different, even in the motivation. These were fanatic. Surely these were some of the most fanatic elements. I mean, you can argue that even within the SS, as we've seen, there were floating standards of indoctrination other than just training. Of course, there would have been a guy in the SS that maybe, did saved Jewish lives. That there have been, because they weren't obviously like any human being. They're not all bad individually. But it's not like the entire purpose of this wasn't bent to the broader cause that ultimately was inspiring them systematically to commit these atrocities. And the same goes for the Wehrmacht identically. And I think it's pretty asinine to pretend otherwise in any space. I can't even imagine which one wouldn't actually be. And by the way, if people are truly indoctrinated still today in these things, why don't they just admit it? Like, what would be the problem for you if you actually believe in these things? That's the thing that I don't really understand. This defensivism of neo-Nazis, neo-fascists, they're ridiculous. It's ballless people that do not even have the courage of saying what they actually think, because they would actually go to jail for that, and that's objectively not much of a, or at least they would be sanctioned in some ways that wouldn't be actually a bad chance for thinking, studying a bit more. But what kind of revolutionary mean is that? If you're not even able to speak the truth, right? You're out of tradition completely. The Holy Ghost does not land on the general, the ruler that says only one lie. You can't be what you want to be, right? So the point is this: this was this mini series about the SS that I thought of making because I know that there are a bunch of exalted people that would click on the on the video just by watching the thumbnail, etc., and getting me money and something. But the general sense is also that we are talking real history, and it's a very interesting topic. Of course, we'll talk more about World War II in general, not just about the SS. But this was a thought-provocative enough topic for us to appreciate, and I'm glad we could conclude this. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.